very good afternoon to one and all attending this program. In fact, a very good evening also to the friends attending from Southeast Asia, and a very good morning to our friends attending from Europe as well as USA. So we have over 20 countries and participating in this webinar, and shows the kind of interest that the world has today for India. And that actually is the theme of today's investment deals webinar, is primarily to see at what India is from the lens of the world, and to give them a ground reality as to what is happening in the Indian ecosystem, made with the distressed asset space, made with the startups much talked about in today's market as well. So with this, I would like to, without much ado, welcome my fellow panelists. I request them to please turn on their videos as well, and I will have a quick introduction of one and all. I will start with Mr. R.K. Bansal. R.K. Bansal ji is the, welcome all panelists. Bansal ji is the MD and CEO of Edelweiss ARC. Edelweiss is one of the largest ARCs operating in India, and Edelweiss has been very active in acquiring as in resolving the NPA in India. I would like to introduce Bansal ji, if you can continue to be on mute, please. I think there is some background noise. Thanks. I would like to introduce Mr. R. Venkatraman. Mr. R. Venkatraman is a managing director at Alvarez & Marsal and A&M, as they are what popularly called here in India. They have been a turnaround specialist and a part of a lot of large and marquee transactions and deals in distressed asset space in IBC and otherwise in India. And welcome, Mr. Venkatraman.
Thank you.
I would like to welcome Inder Karla. Inder has been a founder and and partner at Transiq Corporate Advisors. Transiq is a transaction advisory boutique firm based out of Delhi, and Inder is very active in the startup ecosystem and fundraising space. And welcome to you, Inder. I would like to also welcome Yagnesh Sangrachka. Welcome, Yagnesh. Yagnesh is the founder and CFO of 100x VC, and they are very active in the new age investments in the startup ecosystem, wherein they are very much ingrained with the founder and provide them seed capital and take them to the light of the various rounds of funding. Welcome, Yagnesh. And last but not the least, Prantik Majumdar. Prantik is a managing director at CXM Group, which is part of Dentsu, and he's also a board member at TAI Singapore, and he himself has been a venture and angel investor, and he's based out of Singapore. So a very warm welcome to one and all to this panel, and a very warm welcome to all the attendees. So the world is looking at India, and I think all eyes are on India since a lot is happening here, and probably COVID, especially the way China has been behaving, is only adding to the growth and fueling the growth here in India. So on the distressed asset space, if you look at it on one perspective, before the advent of IBC about 4 years back in 2016, India ranked 130th across the globe as regards the ease of doing business rankings is concerned. And today, as we speak, we are ranked 62, and the rank is just getting better by each passing year. So that 100% notch up is primarily because of the way India has handled its distressed assets and the advent of the IBC and what it has done to the country. It has also seen an influx of capital. It has also seen an entry point for global MNC and large investors in India and overseas to have an entry point into the Indian corporates and the Indian ecosystem. This is what in general has happened in the distressed asset space. On the other side, on the growth side, COVID has brought about a lot of tectonic shift the way tech has been playing out. Today, most of us have been either working from home or continue to operate on working from home. So the technology has been changing, and with that rapid changing technology and lifestyle and changes, so have these startups been fueled by a lot of ideas, and these ideas have been put to at lightning speed, have seen the light of the day. So these are the two broad themes that we would like to touch base today in this panel, and I would like to open this panel by welcoming all the panelists, and I would like to start with Mr. Bansal. Sir, we have seen that the non-performing assets have been, India has faced a problem of the non-performing assets, and you being one of the largest ARCs in India, and recently the advent of also the bad bank, which is now called the NARCL, National Asset Reconstruction Company Limited. So how, and the ARCs as a whole playing a very, very vital and pivotal role both in IBC resolutions of loan in IBC and otherwise in distress asset space. So what are your thoughts, sir? Wanted to hear it directly from the horse's mouth regarding all this which is happening in the distress asset space. But over to you, Bansalji.
Okay, good afternoon to everyone. See, the distress asset space, if you really see the banks, last 4 or 5 years, we have been struggling as bankers with a large NPA percentage. This whole thing started, let's say, after 2015 with the RBI came out with asset quality review. And a lot of infrastructure companies went through a problem, and even steel went through a problem. So at one stage, out of about 13-14% stress asset in the banking system, and the total 10 lakh crore worth NPAs, about 7 to 8 lakh crore were mainly in the corporate segment. Right. Now today, last 3-4 years, we have been resolving these cases, and after IBC, which came in 2016, Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, we have been able to resolve at least cases of about, let's say, worth 3.5 to 4 lakh crore. Partly resolved, partly maybe they are undergoing resolution. Which has happened in the banking system. Many of these cases now have got fully provided for because these are 4 or 5 year old NPAs. So, as per RBI guideline, the provisioning has become almost 100% in these cases. So many stress asset funds have come to India. Many ARCs are also doing this deal, and many promoters also do the settlement. Wherever there is a strategic interest and asset is good, something like steel plants, which we have seen, there could be a strategic interest buying also. If we see the out of first 12 cases which RBI came out with in 2017, 5 were steel cases, and in fact, out of 12, those 5 at least got resolved. With the balance 7, we are still struggling in some way here and there. Except 1 or 2, Alok Textile went through and all. So I'm just saying, I'm not using the names, but I'm just saying this because of steel and because of the commodity. The total recovery of the banking system, of the financial lenders in all NCLT cases up to now has been about 43% of the total claims out of about 340, 350 cases which have been up to, or rather 370. Now, the only difference I would say is if I exclude just 3-4 cases like SR Steel, Bhushan Steel, Binani Cement and Bhushan Power and Steel, then the recovery percentage falls down to about 23%. So, which is almost the same which was there earlier before IBC. So, I would say IBC is good if there is a good asset, good company, and especially commodity sector, and if there is a strategic interest in buying. We have also seen number of cases where and a lot of media hype is being created that haircut is 96%, 97%, 95%. But it finally depends on the company. I mean, we have seen in EPC companies, I myself have 2-3 EPC companies where the debt is today 7,000 crore. And I'm struggling to recover even 200 crore out of that company. But the business model is like that. So it will always depend on the sectors. So, but the resolution will happen. And some cases in the banking system today are like that, where perhaps you have no resolution. So let us accept that situation, and we agree to graciously accept that business has failed and there is no value left, especially if you don't have any hardcore letters. So coming to your other question which you asked me, NARC or bad bank, I don't want to use bad bank in that sense, but National ARC, which is being promoted by the banks themselves to take care of these balanced assets which, as I just said, you are not able to resolve. And some of them are, despite being in IBC, we have not been able to resolve. So these assets will be transferred to this NARCL, and most of these cases are 100% provided. So there is no book value left in the banking system. So you will give some notional value, maybe 10%. And then this will be done under 1585 structure. Typically in ARC language, we say 1585. What does it mean is 15% bank will get in cash and 85% will get as a security receipt, which is something like junk bond. And once you realize that money from these assets later on, that 85% proportionately will go back to the bank. But the only difference here is this 15% cash which is being given is virtually coming from the same bank who will be selling the assets, because the company is being owned by the same banks. So you have about 11, 12 banks and institutions which will be owning this company. It will be in a government public sector. And they will invest about, let's say, 5 to 7,000 crore, which will be the equal to 15% money. And 85% will be issued as a security receipt. And as of today, as I understand, government will be agreeing to give a guarantee to that 85%, so that it gives advantage to the selling banks, maybe from RBI perspective, for some regulatory dispensation. And whenever this ARC, and then there is another company called AMC, or India Debt Management Company, that will try to recover the money and resolve these assets. And once they are able to resolve, and that will remain technically in the private sector, where 50% will be with private sector banks and 49% will be the public sector banks. So that decision making is faster, unlike public sector entities which worry about 3 C's or 4 C's. So finally, once they get the money, this will go back to the banks, and then government guarantee will follow. But if there is any shortfall, then government has to pitch in. And as of today, the amount which is being talked about, government will guarantee about some 30,000 crore. So I think we have to see how it pans out. So as of now, banks have identified about 22 cases in the first list which are being transferred. So my feeling is this is a good move from 2 reasons. One, the ARCs always struggle in aggregation. That means if I have 15 banks, to acquire from 15 banks, it takes time, almost 2 years sometimes. And we are not able to resolve the case if we have not acquired from at least 70-75% debt. So here, the first day itself, you are able to aggregate, because all the banks have to transfer. And then, like say, existing ARCs like us, we ourselves also can buy from this national ARC, because I am getting the advantage of aggregation from the first. I think it's a good move, and it all will also help the banks to clean up their balance sheet, plus also to do warehousing, which in banking system becomes difficult. I can wait once I transfer to ARC, maybe for next 3-4 years, like say power sector. If we try to sell today a power plant, it is virtually 2 crore per megawatt. But if I feel that power will be good in 2 years, I can keep this in this ARC and wait for resolution. I will stop here at that point of time. So I think if anything is there, let me know. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bansalji, for your very insightful opening remarks. In continuation to this, Venkatraman sir, I would like to come to you and take a perspective from your end as to, you have been involved personally also, and A&M has been advising resolution professionals, like we spoke about Essar Steel, the largest resolved insolvency case in India. And otherwise also you've been involved in a lot of other distressed assets and advising other special situation funds as well as PVC funds. So what has your experience been as an advisor, and if you can walk us through that entire experience and share some insights, that will be valuable.
Sure. Thanks, Sahil. So, I will pick up from where Mr. Bansal left it. Fundamentally, any distressed asset, if we look at the root cause of it, either it's the over leveraging or the overall, the project cost through which it has been established, and the over leveraging aspect which has actually created this distress. The cash flows and the fundamentals of the business are able to sustain a certain level of debt, and the moment you are over leveraging it, the system collapses. So we want to fix this problem. The banks and the other institutions need to take action well in time. Like the situation with Mr. Bansal referred about NARCL coming up and accounts which are being 5 years NPA and being transitioned. There may be exceptional assets only which could still be surviving these 5 years of provisioning. What happens is the moment asset gets classified as NPAs, further credit lines are choked. They don't get working capital, they don't get capex for last mile. The asset starts deteriorating downhill, and it's a very steep downhill. So if you want to resolve it through the IBC, you need to get in upfront early. IBC should not be perceived as snatching away from a company from somebody, or declaring it bankrupt. I mean, the IBC construct has to mature out. It's a forum wherein you are given a moratorium, wherein a standstill is provided to resolve the asset. That's where matured markets like the UK and US have reached today. People voluntarily file for it, take benefit of that standstill provision, restructure, reorganize themselves, come out of it, and the business runs. Here, it's like fighting, it's a battle, right? And you push back really to the wall, and in terms of every little iota of gap or thread left in the system is being fought over to either let it go in or let not go in. And this whole delay in admission is only hurting the whole process of IBC. If an asset cannot sustain the debt it holds and it cannot continue to service, it qualifies for a insolvency. The objective should be to push it in, resolve it, come out clean, so that the creditors are benefited. So that, having said that, the interest from special situations fund, especially not so much from the private equity world, they would be typically looking at growth capital deployment. Either primary or even secondary should be fine for them. But special situations and distressed asset funds are really interested in the Indian market. But again, going back to which Mr. Bansal very rightly highlighted, asset quality. Is that asset worthwhile putting in money? Does that asset have something in it for a turnaround? And it can deliver certain cash flows. It may not go up to the level that it was in the prime years or the early years of the business. It could be an impact of the market. It could be a impact of costing structure, pricing structure, everything. But is there a window for that asset to continue providing regular cash flows? Those kind of assets, people are interested. They continue to show interest. They are willing to buy it on their own. They are willing to back other strategic players to secure it through insolvency. So they back maybe an ARC. They back, not an ARC, I would say, they back a strategic to buy out those assets. So that's what they really look for. And the second route through which they would ideally like to come in is buying secondary debt, pre-admission or immediately post-admission until resolution. So the banks might be willing to sell the debt at a discount, which a lot of these special situation funds would like to aggregate. The objective being aggregate to the level that they have a significant majority holding position, and then they can steer the resolution of that particular asset which goes into IBC. They have a 67% plus shareholding in the COC. They can very well steer where this company needs to go. The objective is ultimately most of these are national assets contributing to the GDP, contributing to the economy. The objective is not to kind of let that all squander away or get wasted. The objective would be to recover as much value as you can from these assets, barring those cases again like a pure EPC company where it's just a shell of order book and no assets underlying it, nobody's going to touch it. So it's the interest from these funds are very specific asset classes, asset quality, ability to kind of turn around, and potential of completing its residual life of the asset with a reasonable cash flow. That would determine their interest, and that would determine the price at which they want to come in. The one other key aspect which every overseas investor is concerned while putting in money in India is about liabilities. And the IBC gives a platform for cleansing up that. That's the reason why they're all interested in looking at IBC situations, and an outside court settlement could still leave issues behind. And once they walk in, you can see skeletons out of the cupboard. So they want it washed clean, which the IBC provides. And so there is definitely interest. It's a wait and watch for them to pick the right asset. I would stop here for the moment in terms of what we have really picked up.
It's a cleaner slate for sure, and that is definitely will add on to the transparency and hence will obviously lead to a better maximization of value Great. So I think.
But one other
having heard
input I would
about
like to add, is that the judicial process need to expedite on the timelines, and all resolutions and all turnaround and all of these aspects are very critically time bound. The delay is actually hurting the asset quality.
Correct.
That needs to be somehow arrested. So that's something which we need to improve upon. Starting off with 180 days to 330 days to 370. We have seen cases where resolutions have happened in 180 days. The judicial process has taken 270 days. So that should be ideally avoided. Minimize the litigation, use the existing established case laws to kind of dispose and give orders on some of these resolutions speedier way. It's actually going to help.
Great. Thank you so much, sir. And good to get your thoughts on this. And quickly moving on to the growth side of it, wherein, recently, I think everybody's been talking about Zomato and every startup founder wants to be the next Zomato. Let's hear it directly from your mouth. You've been ingrained into the startup ecosystem. What are your thoughts? How is the funding environment in the startups for now? Any changes which you have seen during and post the COVID scenarios? And if you can talk a little bit for the exits that we have seen recently, and also open up to other large IPOs which are lined up in the pipeline. Over to you.
Sure. Thank you and good evening, everyone. So I think Mr. Sailesh has covered it well when in the opening remarks, he said about how the situation has changed from the COVID times, right? So all of us, we have seen, right, what has happened during the COVID. Everybody was just stuck at their home and they were not able to go out, and even the funding stopped for the startup, I think, which we have seen, the people who are connected with the startup world, they have seen. But those 3-4 months was bad for everyone, including the startups, right? They were not getting funding. But what has happened after that, right? There was a lot of liquidity which has been pumped by the central governments, by again the saving, as Mr. Sailesh was saying. So that money and the digitalization which has happened due to has been again pushed the growth through 2-3 years forward, right? So that led the VC community or the PE community to see that this is coming in, and the amount of money which has come from the, you can say, again from your government side, the stimulus, also on the savings from this, has come into this growth stage capital, right, for these startups which are there for the longer term, which people are seeing right now, right? And to add to that, what has happened, as you were asking about the exit options, right? So exit options have again created in India the options for the VCs to see India as an, so it provides an opportunity for the VCs to exit also. Previously, what was happening is that if you were saying that PEs were not able to do the IPOs for the companies, right? They have to go to the companies have to list to maybe the US, they have to go to US, go to the other countries to get listed. But after this change of the SEBI guidelines, what it has given push to that, they have a clear path to exit also in India itself. So if you see Zomato, it gives a great, I think, response from everybody. And now we have seen that Delivery, Nykaa, and you see this is the Paytm, MobiKwik, and all are lining up for the IPOs, right? What it does, it gives a faith for the LP community, which is limited partner community. It gives a confidence to them to invest in the Indian ecosystem again, right? They are backing up the VCs now based out of India, because now they can see that companies can list into India and it can really provide them exit, right? So that kind of again will push the growth story within India. And we have again seen what has happened in China right now, right? So there has been a tech crackdown by the government, right? Luckily, we might get benefit out of it. We are not sure as of now, but as the things will progress, we might see that the capital which has to go to China might come back. It might make some way to India also, right? Because there's again a lot of capital which has been pumped in during this time, right? The capital has to go somewhere. It cannot just sit idle, right? And the interest rate being so low at 1-2%, the VCs has to invest money somewhere, right? So India might be one of the beneficiary out of that trend. And just to add to this, yesterday I was just reading about the IMF chief economist. What she was saying is that the growth in the developed market will continue to be there just because they are getting vaccinated and the governments are not withdrawing the stimulus, right? So the stimulus is not getting withdrawn, they are getting growth. You can say the LP community might invest or give more capital towards the VC community because they might, the VC or the PE community has kind of given them the greater return maybe than the public listed company last 5-7 years. So the VC and PE community might get more allocation and that might come directly towards the growth for these companies, right? So the future is great for, I think, the startup community.
I agree with you. I mean, couldn't have been a better time either for the Indian ecosystem, and I think COVID and China it has only helped India, and it is clearly by the kind of blockbuster response that we've seen for Zomato and the kind of IPOs which are already.
I think we will see more IPOs and more growth, and I think the tech community or the new generation community, they relate to them, right? So if you see the people are talking about the valuation of Zomato being crazy, right? I think we will have that discussion maybe later on. But the new age doesn't feel that it's expensive, right? Because they can relate to it. They want to buy the company which they can relate to. Maybe they can't relate to ITC, but they can relate to Zomato.
Yeah, great. Thanks a lot, Inder. I mean, let's see where does the next unicorn come from in India, and all our eyes are there on that. Great. So I will move on to Yagnesh. Yagnesh, if you can. So you have been working with the common man, the common Indian entrepreneur who has just ventured into a startup. You help them provide seed capital, see their ideas, see the light of the day, dirty your hands yourself, and handhold them. And please run us through this entire journey and what has your experience been? Are there exits? How have COVID changed things? Tell us the India story right from your mouth, Yagnesh, from the lens of a micro VC. Over to you, Yagnesh.
Well, thanks, Sahil. I hope I'm audible. Just checking. Yeah, well, thanks, guys. Thanks for this opportunity, and love to hear the views of all the panelists. And well, we bring a very different side to the entire story, right? The whole startup ecosystem. This is where Zomato probably was 10 years back, and somebody funded Zomato with a great hope. And we are into actually the startup ecosystem 2.0 actually is what I would like to define. We were in 1.0 maybe 2009 to 2019-20, and post-COVID literally triggered off the 2.0 in our opinion. And because we post-COVID, there's been a lot of transformation of businesses, and I'm not getting into details of what happened. Everybody knows about it. We're still discovering the full impact of that. However, the startup ecosystem has actually grown stronger. On the back of COVID, we saw resilient businesses actually overcome the difficulties, right? So the good ones actually came out with flying colors, and resilient founders, persistent founders, those who don't give up were the ones which came out winners. And exactly, the funding ecosystem has rightly rewarded these founders with a lot of funding, and you're seeing the news practically every day. But just to give you another perspective, what we see in the news is just the tip of the iceberg. The actual revolution actually has started at the ground level. We call it at the bottom of the pyramid. So that's where we work, Sahil, and 100x at 100x.vc. We work with bootstrap founders. So when we started the fund 2019, let me just briefly capture the summary of the journey, and that pretty much will give you and everybody a little flavor of what's happening. So when we started the fund in 2019, all founders, all 5 of us actually came together and discussed the pain points of the startup ecosystem. And Sanjay, as you know, is a legendary angel investor, and he's been investing in the ecosystem for the last 9-10 years. What we really saw was that no one really was working at the grassroots level, right? So we see a lot of accelerators. Of course, they're doing a brilliant job of incubating, and a lot of efforts put in just making these startups more fundable, more available, VC ready. But there was this whole professional touch which had the VC experience lacking. I have come from a VC background. I used to be working with Bessemer Venture Partners in my prior life, prior to a couple of my corporate stints. But we all felt that there's no one who is really working with the founders, making them VC ready. And when I say VC ready, it's right from the ideation stage, may it be a pre-revenue stage, may it be a minimum viable product, trying to scale, trying to find their first customer. A lot of people have brilliant ideas, they've developed good products, but there are no businesses who are ready to buy these products or services. So we really wanted to work at this grassroots level, and we really started this whole journey of beginning to say that, look, fine, let's look at bootstrap founders. There are plenty of them, and the numbers was already increasing, as you know, right? We already have more than 65-70,000 startups registered with DIPP India, as part of the startup initiative by the government of India. And we are seeing that number grow pretty much every month. So we knew that there are people out there wanting to start up. Entrepreneurial wave already has caught the country. But how do we channelize all of this so that we get more and more viable startups who are able to be funded? And that's a very big statement. It takes a lot of effort to get them ready to get funded. So we started working at that, and we started our first class, and we invest in a class mode. We did our first 20 investments in 2019, and then post that in January, February, pretty much March 2020, we had the pandemic hit everyone. Of course, things halted a bit, but then we funded our second class in September 2020. And so far, we've invested in 50 companies. What we've seen common across, is that a lot of the new entrepreneurs, and by the way, there are student entrepreneurs, there are young entrepreneurs, there are experienced entrepreneurs who come in the front, start, and they've been working in some corporates, but haven't been able to address certain key issues while they're working in their corporates, doing their job 9 to 5, and pretty much not able to really make a difference to the entire system. When you're working in a corporate, and I've done that for 25 years, what you are impacting is just one organization. But when you start working for a fund, you part of the fund, you're funding companies, you then become part of the whole ecosystem. You are able to impact many more lives. So 50 companies that we have funded have impacted more than 150 founders, have created almost 600 jobs so far. And so we feel really we take pride in doing that. And these are founders who are coming out of colleges, coming out of IITs. Some are experienced, so we really have to work closely with them. We started a unique way of investing, which is through the iSafe, and that kind of eases out the whole investment process. So we made it frictionless. So we found a founder-friendly document, which kind of most founders don't understand how the whole investment documentation works. We made it very simple into a 5-page document. So some of the experiences that we have seen, founders understand their business but don't understand the laws, don't understand the huge documentation and the legal language. So how do you make it easy? So we worked on that, did that, and thankfully it's been successful. 50 companies that we have funded, 80-90% of them have already raised their seed round. So that just validates not just our success, but it also validates that this whole ecosystem is now mature. You're able to see more companies coming out raising seed rounds, and these are the ones who are going to become unicorns in the next 5 years, 10 years. That's what we are trying to create, and that's pretty much our journey so far. Happy to take more discussions and questions ahead.
Thanks, Yagnesh, for your perspective on that. What I will take the liberty to ask you one question. There is one question addressed regarding what startup sectors are you seeing super high transaction? So if you can just quickly throw some light and your experience on that. If you can name a few sectors.
Sure, very valid question, Sahil. We're seeing a lot of these sectors, new sectors coming in. Some of the less favored ones have now become more favored. Like, you're seeing this whole wave of B2B SaaS technical startups, which were, in the fringes, but now they have come ahead. They are finding solutions for verticals that we didn't really understand before. So, some of these B2B SaaS startups have come up very well. Some of them have funded. We have more than a dozen investments in B2B startups. There are women entrepreneurs who are bringing in, e-commerce platforms. So e-commerce is absolutely right in the front, as you would imagine. But yeah, there are deep tech. There are robotics. We've even funded a drone company. So these are the sectors which are now coming up. EduTech, of course, has always been there and just kind of propelled more after the COVID situation. But now all EduTech startups will have to really think hard, because now we are looking at a hybrid future way of working and learning as well. So somebody who's going to be working at the hybrid model, with a lot of combinations there will succeed, and we are seeing that happening already. So yeah, I mean, EduTech, AgriTech, B2B SaaS, all of this is actually now happening very much, and these are the deals that we are looking at. Of course, also new things like automation, RPA, robotic process automation. These are things which help enterprises scale with less time to market, and just speeds up the time to market as much. These are the tools that kind of are the future of work, and that's what we are investing in.
Great. Thank you so much, Agnesh, for your grassroots experiences that you've shared with us on this. So, having heard from the 4 panelists, who have been stationed and physically located here in India, I think it will be very important and relevant to get a perspective from Prantik Majumdar. Prantik is stationed in in Singapore, and he looks at investments flowing into India. So, Prantik, if you can throw some light onto how does Singapore or the Southeast Asian markets look at India at this point of time, and has COVID all the more fueled up the interest levels that the Singapore and Southeast Asian markets have in India? And there is one question, and I'll take the liberty to throw that at you, Prantik, is that there are other investment alternatives at other countries also, maybe Bangladesh, or depending upon what is the Korea, Japan, and others. So how do you compare India versus these other investment destinations, and your thoughts on the whole, Prantik? Over to you.
Thanks, Sahil. No, thanks for having me, and good morning, good evening to everyone. So yeah, I think from that perspective, I think India has always had a very, from a Singapore lens, both geopolitically as well as from a investment and commercial perspective, India always has had a very good perception in the Southeast Asian ecosystem, especially Singapore. Singapore genuinely looks up to India because of the trade relations as well as geopolitical relations. I think in the recent past there's been some great I think we spoke about Zomato and a few other cases. I think if you look at the sovereign wealth funds of Singapore, Temasek and GIC, I think they've been very active in India for the last 15-20 years, right from the famous Airtel deal to now all these startups that you're looking at. So I think typically in Singapore, I think everything is top down, right? So I think if Temasek and GIC lead the way, I think that sends a very positive signal. And then you have various other family offices, various VCs and PEs. So I think it's a given. I think India's a market that can't be ignored. I think the sheer amount of capital that the Indian startup ecosystem has kind of attracted. I mean, I think recently there was a great story about even the likes of Tiger Global in the last 6-7 years, right? From their the Flipkart, the famous Flipkart deal that ReefXL led. I think there are some very good signals. So I think from a investment perspective, I think India is in a very good position. I think Singapore plays the other role as well. I think a lot of the Indian startups, and maybe this is an opportunity for India to kind of perhaps figure out alternatives, because what we're also seeing is a lot of Indian startups typically end up basing their headquarters out of Singapore, just given tax structures, given the financial opportunity out here, right? So it's not really that they're basing out of, so there are some that base out of Singapore to tackle China or to tackle Southeast Asia, but many of them, I mean, Flipkart is a classic example. There's been a lot written that perhaps Singapore gained more than India when it came to financially, simply because Singapore has those tax advantages. It's very, very investor friendly. And maybe that's an opportunity, even from an angel investor perspective. I've looked at a lot of deals in India. And of course, I think, Yagnesh was speaking about, I think there's just so much happening and there's so much opportunity. One thing that I would like to see differently is, I think if the tax regime or the structures are more favorable to foreign capital, whether at an angel level or VC level, because that's something one has to factor. For example, of course, Singapore, Dubai, Hong Kong, the countries are structured where, capital gains is non-existent or rather low. Corporate taxes are, non-existent or rather low. But I think if something can be done at an angel level, I think India will benefit tremendously, because I think, as we heard in the keynote early in the day, that there's just plenty of capital looking to be deployed. And I think India is at this cusp with, unicorns and soonicorns being formed across multiple sectors. So I think it's a positive outlook, but I think from a taxation perspective, from a structural perspective, I think there is still a bit of way to go. But as Inder said, good to see that exit options are plenty, within the Indian market. To your other question of alternates, I think Bangladesh is a very good example. I personally am seeing, sitting in Singapore, I think what they have done very well is they again maybe behind the curve from India at a startup level. So you're probably seeing a Zomato equivalent or a Byju's wannabe emerging from there. Again, very similar model. Most of those good startups like Shohoj, like Shikho, like Shuttle, many of these guys are just basing their headquarters in Singapore. They typically have a resident director, and they're leveraging on high net worth capital from here to get their initial checks. And then of course the Sequoia Surges of the world are kind of coming and pooling in capital to kind of take them ahead. But I must say, what Bangladesh has done very well is on the broader what they call the PEST indicators, right? Your political, economics, social indicators, they've actually done very, very well. Even if you look at their growth in per capita income, I think that's done tremendously well in the last 7 to 8 years. So I would definitely look at, Bangladesh being the other opportunity where a lot of the Korean, Japanese, or Singapore, where, capital is relatively cheap, or Japan, where it's negative interest rates, they're looking at these opportunities as well. Closer to home, I think the two other places which have tremendous potential for investments is Indonesia, Vietnam. So if you look at Southeast Asia, collectively, Singapore is very small, 5 million, right? Smaller than any major city in India. But if I look at Indonesia, Vietnam, that's where honestly, where the action is within Southeast Asia, right? So Southeast Asia as a whole, the 10 countries make up about 600 million people, about more than 50% are on the internet. So again, I think Indonesia, Vietnam, probably slightly again behind India on many of these the startup ventures. But again, if you look at B2B commerce, you're seeing Meesho, Udaan equivalents come up in Indonesia. Like the Zomato IPO case, Bukalapak is looking to list within Indonesia itself. You have the massive 40 billion Grab and Tokopedia SPACs, which will send a very positive signal. Shopee, which went public in the US market, was obviously the first success story, major exit success story from Southeast Asia. But what's changing is, I think you have new exit models like SPAC coming into being. You have exits within the country like Indonesia. And also, I think Vietnam as a market, to me, after Indonesia, is massive. I think, be it in terms of fintech, digital banking licenses, or even logistical opportunities, right, are kind of coming to the fore. And if you look at Vietnam, for example, a lot of Korean and Japanese money is flowing to Vietnam as we speak, apart from money that is kind of housed in Singapore through VCs and PEs. So I think there is good, healthy competition. But I think to your original question, I think absolutely, I think especially with Temasek and GIC, I think the intention is very clear. They all want to capitalize on right from early stage to late stage opportunities in the Indian startup ecosystem.
Great. Thank you so much, Prantik, to give us that perspective. And we are running on time. I would have liked to, give another round of closing remarks to one and all, but unfortunately, because of the shortage of time, I have not been able to do that. But I would like to take an opportunity to thank all the panelists to share their valuable insights. And I think we very well covered starting the distressed asset space, what is happening, how are the funds viewing India, what is the kind of value creation and the resolutions happening on ground, And then we looked at the startups and the entire startup ecosystem blooming, changing, defining, redefining. And then we in the end spoke about how the Southeast Asian markets look at India and how they compare it with the other investment alternatives that they have. With this, I think we have done justice to the time that has been allotted to us. And with this, I would like to hand over back to Raj. And thank you so much, audience, and thank you so much, panelists, inputs and insights. Wonderful panel. Thank you so much, Raj. Over to you.
Thanks, Raj. Thanks, Sahil.